So here we are to talk about the BRC. What is the BRC? Hopefully all of you have gotten an electronic copy of the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission in your mail. I was hoping we'd have hard copies here, but evidently those are a little expensive and they wouldn't let us have those, so you got them all electronically. But the Blue Ribbon Commission is a publication that is done every year by NACD, and they take one topic that somebody chooses and they do a deep dive into that topic. And the commission is made up of experts in the field, directors that represent all walks of life in all industries. And we are very, very fortunate that we actually have two of the BRC commissioners as our panelists today. Both of these gentlemen contributed in huge part to a very, very interesting study on culture as foundation, building a high-performance board. And it's a topic that a lot of us here in the room care deeply about. In fact, by virtue of the fact that you're here, means you care deeply about board culture. And let me just summarize real quickly that the BRC is organized into three primary areas, if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. The first is in pursuit of board agility. Recognizing the challenging dynamics that companies face today, and the challenges the pace of change is faster than we ever imagined. It's really essential for boards to examine how we work through our agendas, our processes, our committee structures, and director composition and engagement. It's just really important to make sure we are agile and we can change with the times and help our executive teams with the challenging environment. The second area is building a board performance culture, recognizing the importance of intentional and healthy board culture to build trust and candor among directors with management, which is really imperative. Creating a performance culture on your board like we create performance cultures in our organizations is really important, and the BRC talks about the importance of making sure you do that. The third, which the BRC always has, is recommendations for action, the what I call "so what do we do" section of the BRC. Because it's one thing to talk about why this is important. It's another thing to give directors tools for what we can do to make our boards better and stronger. The three key areas that they define to reshape culture is first, define the optimal board culture. Second is to reinforce that culture and behavioral norms. And third, probably most importantly, address the cultural fault lines. Where is it not working? So with that quick overview, I'm going to open it up to some conversation here. I'm going to start with Gaurdie. It may feel a little weird for directors to bring up the topic of culture in boardrooms. I mean, we are accustomed to talk about the company's performance and challenges and all that, but to actually take time to talk about how do we as a board work and what is it that makes us what we are could feel a little awkward for some directors. Why is this important to do?
So yeah, just talking about culture and why is that so hard. It's absolutely fascinating. So most people who are on boards, virtually everybody who sits on a board, matriculated somehow through a company. And in doing so, we all got to lead a team, right? Everybody had to lead a team at some point. And while we were doing that, we were intentional about how the team performed. But what's really fascinating is that one of the most important teams in the company didn't spend a whole lot of time on how the team performed, right? So I think that was sort of the conclusion that we drew when we got into and started talking about this. So part of it's because I think people who, when you if you moved out of the C-suite or out of your role and you're now in retirement, you're saying to yourself, okay, well, I get to go to the board, but I don't have to work on all that other stuff. I'm not going to work on team building. I'm not going to work on this. I'm going to come, I'm going to do my thing at the board meeting, and then I'm going to go back home and forget about you for 3 months or however long that is, right? So I think some of it had to do with sort of the attitude of people. But my creed is, I think if you want the company to be world-class, then the board has to be world-class. And so I think it's impossible to contemplate that a company could be world-class and the board would not be world-class. So what that means is we have to be intentional about what the board is actually doing, how it's getting together, how it's operating, what are the skills and capabilities, how does it work together. All of that is important if in fact you're part of a business, and everything I want to be a part of, I want to be world class. So I try to drive this in places where I sort of navigate. I think that's part of what makes it really, really important. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You made the point. We think we finish these executive careers and we retire and then sit on boards. Anyone in this room who thinks they're a director and they're retired doesn't get it, because it's not retirement, is it? I mean, it could have been 20 years ago, and I think 20 years ago when board careers started, it was just one of those nice things people got to do, and they went to nice places, they had meetings, they went golfing. That's the way boards were 25, 30 years ago. And it's no longer something you do in retirement. So I find that just an interesting perspective. So Jarvis, who handles this conversation? Is this a nom and gov-led conversation? Is it chair-led? Is it the whole board? How do you do this?
It's an interesting question, I think, and we spent a lot of time talking about this on the BRC. Essentially leadership has historically been the, what I call the culture carrier for the board. And so the chair typically sets the tone, and we'll get into some details later about some things where I think the chair really has to be involved in setting that tone. But sort of the nuts and bolts carrier of this is going to be your nom-gov committee. Because the nom-gov committee is going to put in processes, going to put in procedures. To have a world-class board, everybody has to be on the same page. Everybody has to understand what the expectations are. There has to be one board that meets in the boardroom, not 2 or 3 boards outside the boardroom. There have to be expectations for performance, and you're going to find those in processes typically created by your nom-gov committee. Now, your board chair or your lead independent director and your nom-gov chair should work very closely together, because they're almost a check on each other with respect to governance.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, Gaurdie.
The only thing I'd add is that it is in the nom-gov responsibilities. And so what's that mean? As a practical matter, it needs to be written in the charter. So if your charter doesn't say that the nom-gov committee owns the culture and that's part of what they should do, then don't expect it to get done, right? Every year, everybody takes a look at the charter and says, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. But if it's not written in the charter, then how can you expect them to get it done?
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about why it's important, and we've talked about who should lead the conversation. So in your estimation, and as you all put this BRC together, what do you think are the most difficult parts of the wheel that you show, all the things that have to get done? What's the toughest part to get done?
Well, so I'll start. I have 2 that I sort of think about. And by the way, it's when you look at the wheel, I would suggest you don't cherry pick anything in particular unless it applies to your particular board. So one of the things, and some of you guys know this person, Lynn Elsenhans, has sort of been a board mentor for me for a long time. I've known Lynn a long time. And when I was talking to her before I joined my first board, one of the things she said was all boards are different. And she's right. All boards are different. The dynamic, everything is absolutely different. And so you have to look at the recommendations and apply them to your situation. We know that NACD is all boards, large and small. So just one word of caution. But I think the thing that I would say on the wheel that stands out to me has to do with the inclusive one, which is number 6. And so many times, and we had big, long conversations about this too, so many times people join a board and they kind of get hooked to somebody, or they kind of try to feel their way around, but there's not a really high quality, robust onboarding process that people understand how does this actually work. And to be honest, before you accept a board position, so I know everybody in here probably already on a board, but before you accept a board position, you should be asking those questions. How does this work? I remember one time I turned down a board because I found out that they had a bunch of cliques and they sort of had a hierarchy of different people who would kind of speak up and talk. I didn't want to be a part of something like that. So you should be interrogating that. But when you're onboarding people, making sure that it's a robust process, that people get partnered up with somebody to help them understand how to navigate, that the lead director or the independent chair is regularly talking to that person as you go along to be sure that they come together. To me, that's a really, really important aspect of culture. And in particular these days, as we are bringing in more people who have different backgrounds, whether they're out of the technology space or they're younger or they're people of color or from different parts of the world or whatever, if you want to have the richness of all those differences, then you need to ensure that people are getting engaged. You need to ensure that they're being welcomed. You need to ensure that their voices are being heard and that you create the space and the climate for them to be able to talk and not get overruled by all the people who've been sitting on the board for 10 or 15 years. So that's why I think that's a really, really important one.
I think that's particularly important nowadays where, I mean, it used to be you didn't join a board unless you were a former CEO or you were potentially a former CFO, and you had board-facing roles. You actually have people joining boards today that haven't had board-facing roles, which are, you know, people who are in the room beyond their presentation, right? So if someone has a technology background, oftentimes the only time they've had any board interaction is when they go in and present and then they leave. Or someone who is a diversity person or a, you know, marketing person, as I was. I mean, you go in, you present and you leave, you really don't know what directors do. And so I think that's a really good point, because more and more now we've got functional experts, people who are specialize in certain areas, people who have unique backgrounds, and they haven't been in a boardroom throughout a meeting. So good point.
And the only thing I would add to that is, you know, the way the wheel is organized, it's really sort of a third assessing yourselves, then it's maintaining whatever you agree is the right standard, and then it's dealing with the problematic directors. And I mean, I think the reason this was such a call to action by the BRC is we're confronting such a different operational and societal environment right now. And so I think the issue here really was, let's get people to understand, because I think we all intuitively do, but let's get people to actually put what we think is important into action. So I think the first critical step is getting boards, and these are going to be the soft issues, to actually spend the time to assess, what is our board culture? I mean, are we a really high-performing board? Can we really disagree with each other in critical ways and still have a great working relationship? So assessing the board, I think, is absolutely critical. And hopefully everybody in here and all the boards around the country will actually do that. The other part of it on the back end is the problematic director.
So yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay.
Let's talk
Yeah,
about
that's,
the project
that's
director.
where I was going to go.
There we go. Let's dive
You
in.
want to ask a question, or you want us to just
Yeah,
sort of
you-
jump?
So
Well,
jump in.
Yeah, so again, all of us have led teams throughout the course of our careers. And when people underperform, there were systems and processes to help deal with people who were poor performers, right? But at the board level, for some reason, we are just really scared to do that because everybody's peers. You got CEOs and CFOs, and they're not used to somebody telling them that they didn't perform or that they're not adding value or kind of whatever. So it's where everybody's walking on eggshells trying to have a conversation about performance. And so that's where I think that probably the most, at least in my experience, the most difficult thing to do is to have a conversation with somebody who you don't feel like is productive in the boardroom. Because everybody's kind of waiting, walking around on eggshells, or side conversations, this, that, and the other, and not really wanting to have sort of that hard conversation. Because it might be the former CEO of a Fortune 50 company, right? Who just happens to not be effective in this circumstance. I remember somebody saying one time, you know, when we were talking about age limits, would you kick Warren Buffett off your board if he was however old he is? He says, well, I don't know if I'd kick him off the board, but I think I might ask him, or if he wasn't adding as much value, I think I'd say, hey, we'd like you to do more of this, right? And we'd like you to do less of that. And so that's to me is a really, really big deal, is people have got to stop walking on eggshells and decide that it's time to actually have those constructive conversations. And so I'm not talking about rock 'em, sock 'em, kick them in the hindquarters and sort of kick people out. But in fact, I'll even ask, so how many of you have had to ask somebody to leave a board in this room? So we have a few. So I'm one of those people. And I did it exactly how I did when I was working. I would make sure throughout the course of the year, hey, we need to see this different from you. We need to see this different from you. And then when it didn't change, since board work is a service, not a job, hey, this isn't working out. It's time for you to move on in a really straightforward way. So that's sort of how I'll start that conversation. Jarvis, you probably have something else to add too.
Well, I know you have another question coming up.
Nope, go
about,
ahead.
You know, and I think what we talked about sort of a bit that I want to cover is you know, the stigma around being off-boarded. And I think there's a few ways that boards can deal with that. One is don't run from the conversation. Have it early. Talk about off-boarding during your onboarding process.
Absolutely.
Make sure everybody understands now, you know, boards have term limits, age limits. But how do you deal with a director that's being off-boarded for performance reasons? Talk about that during onboarding. That normalizes it. It creates an environment where, again, everybody understands, because hopefully you also have your tenured board members also participating in the onboarding. So you kind of have a conversation about off-boarding and what it means and why we do it. Something else that may be also helpful is continuously update your skills audit. Because as we go through operational and changes, the skills needed on the board, as we all know, have changed over the last 10 years. So if you're constantly updating that skills audit, and you've got that director, and you've got 10 boxes and everybody's name, and all of a sudden only one box or two is being checked for a certain director, everybody sort of sees, including that director, well, maybe I'm not sufficiently pulling my weight. Maybe I no longer have the skill set to be a productive member of this board.
Yeah, and I think the earlier you start this conversation, the better. So I actually think it goes back even further, and that is when someone is put on a board, asked to join a board, what are the expectations of that person? How have we set expectations? Does that person actually believe this is a Supreme Court appointment? Is this a forever? Because you are such a phenomenal executive, you've had such a phenomenal career, you are now here indefinitely. If that's the case, you got a problem from day one, right? And so there should be an expectation, I believe, when someone joins a board, that they are on a board because of certain skills, backgrounds that are essential to this chapter of what this company is going through. We all believe there are different CEOs that are needed for different chapters. What makes us think the same board should take a company through a 25-year journey, right? And so setting the expectation from the very beginning, I think, is important. And then, as you both say, having ongoing conversations. Make it part of a routine. Make it part of an annual conversation about what do we like about these people? What do we wish they would do more of? What do we wish they would do less of? And having that conversation, it's like building a file on an employee. You all have fired employees before. You know what that's like. If you do it right, it should not be a surprise. So let's talk a little bit about forming that culture where it's familiar, people become friends, and as a result, you are able to have, it's even tougher to have some of these difficult conversations. What are some things we can do process-wise with committee structure, rotating leadership, things like that can kind of unhinge a little bit of that super comfortable atmosphere that causes people to be more performance-oriented and less friendship clubby-oriented?
Well, I think you got to start again. I mean, I think it starts with having written processes where it's clear what the expectations are for everyone, from participating in board meetings to any aspect of board service, and onboard that very clearly. I think also your board chair or your leadership or your lead independent director, depending on your situation. Even though board culture, I think, is the responsibility of all directors, I think that leadership bears a lot more of the responsibility. They can and should be the culture carrier. Now, sometimes we see that in the nom-gov chair. Sometimes we see outsized influence by more tenured, more senior directors. Those are all dynamics that drive this whole culture conversation, because you seem to have a strata within the boardroom. Some people feel more comfortable directing, stating their opinion, disagreeing with other directors. Others, especially in this world now where we're having younger directors, less experienced directors, I think sort of the phrase I hear is this psychological comfort, to speak up at the board table, even though you're younger, you're less experienced. And so I think creating an environment where the standards are clear, the expectations, everybody knows what they are, and leadership enforces them will change that dynamic.
Leadership.
But we have to stand up and do it to people who we're friends with, people who we've worked with, people who we're colleagues with at this club or wherever we are.
Leadership is essential. So a question I would have for both of you is, what happens if the leader is the problem? What happens if the chair, and you know, I see some heads nodding here. What happens if the chair is the one that keeps it clubby and keeps it cliquey? What do you do?
Well, I think you.
Sorry, that wasn't one of the questions we agreed I would ask. Sorry, that's a surprise.
But it's a valid question.
It's a great question.
It's real.
It's absolutely a valid question. I think you have to do. So I go back to the critical principle here. Being on a board is service. It's not a job. And oh, by the way, I believe as a human being that I need to be getting energy from places, more energy from them than I'm putting in. So my advice to anyone where there's a situation where it's the chair or somebody in a position of leadership is you spend some time trying to make a change. And if you can't make that change, then don't run for re-election.
Yeah.
Period. That's it. Why subject yourself to something that you are having to put a huge amount of energy into that you're not looking forward to? I mean, you all know the board pack is 500 to 1,000 pages. If you're lucky, if you have maybe a small board, I don't know anybody has something under 400 pages. Anybody in here have a board pack that's less than 400 pages? I mean, come on, you got all that work to do. If you're not having fun at it, if you're not looking forward to it because of the dynamic on the board, just don't run for re-election. Full stop. That's it. That's literally all you can do, because it's service. It's not a job.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I stepped off a large cap board a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason was I was on for 16 years. But the other reason is because, you know what? My time was done. To be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, you know what? This is not what I want to be spending time doing. Because if you do it right, it's a lot of time. I've got other things, other boards, other opportunities that will happen, and I'm done. And that, it's important to do that. It's important as directors. We owe it to the executives that we support, that if you feel like you can no longer add value or as much as you did, to not be afraid of walking away.
Well, and that's why we sort of talked a little bit about, putting some of these things in writing so that at some point it becomes obvious to everybody around the table, either through performance or otherwise, that you have problem directors. Yeah. And hopefully that will give the psychological safety, whatever you think you need, for a majority of board members to say, we need to come together and ask our chair to step down. And if you're not willing to do that, then, I mean, to me, especially if it's impacting the board's performance, which means it's probably impacting the company's performance, and I would suspect that your fiduciary duty requires you to do that.
I mean, it's interesting. All of us read the news articles about companies that do ridiculous things and do stupid things. And the first thing we always ask, at least I do, is where was the board? Where was the board, right? And so if we can do that as a third party when you're reading an article in the paper, then we should certainly do it holding a mirror up to ourselves and saying, are we being the best stewards of this business, representing people who can't be in the room? Is this the right group of people? And that's, it's uncomfortable for many, but in this day and age, essential because of everything these companies are facing.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, it's our job. It's what we're supposed to do. It's service. It's what we signed up for.
And oh, by the way, if an activist comes to see you, they will find you out.
That's right.
Right? The activists have a very, very keen sense of who they believe is performing and who's not. Sometimes it's right and sometimes it's not so right. But at the end of the day, invite an activist to be in because the board has been dysfunctional and the company's not performing, and that gets turned over on its head really, really fast.
And they'll find that uninvolved director that doesn't really prepare, is not really engaged.
Well,
in those situations.
And the interesting thing is, if an activist can sense there's problems, I mean, all they need to do is talk to some of the executives. It doesn't take much for activists to figure out who's prepared, who's doing their emails at board meetings. I mean, it's not a secret. Everybody knows, right? Okay, I actually have one question for these guys that I dreamt up when you guys were having your table exercise, and that is, since COVID, we have been relying a lot on technology, and there are a lot of boards that have chosen to have some meetings virtually instead of in person. I'm on some boards where half the meetings are, they're trying to have virtual and all that. How do you do culture? How do you do board culture if you're virtual?
It's hard. It's really difficult. I mean, there's just no substitute for this. You can't do this on a screen. You can't have difficult conversations over Zoom. You can. Obviously, we do. I'm just saying they're probably not nearly as effective as they could be. It's difficult to show empathy. It's difficult to show emotions and have whoever your recipient is, really feel that over Zoom. So I really think we've lost a lot. I think every board that I'm on, we still have Zoom committee meetings between board meetings, but the board meets in person for every meeting. Unless there's, these are nonprofit boards or cost is an issue where, they're saving money. But all of my corporate boards, we're back to full meeting 100% in person.
Yeah, I would echo what Jarvis said, and I would just ask you to reflect on your own time when you have been doing a Zoom call, and whether or not you took time out to do email, or to if you got a little putter thing in your office there, you putted a couple balls, or whatever you did that sort of distracted you while something was going on the screen, and you have your answer as to whether or not how effective it is. So it was okay when we had to do it. It's not so okay when you don't have to do it. I think of all of mine, we have one virtual meeting in one of my boards. Everything else, unless there's a problem, everything else is face to face. And so again, so my personal experience. So I joined the Dow board in August of 2020. So it was right in the middle of the pandemic. And I had met Jim and the lead director, and we had all our conversations just before the pandemic. Actually, as Houston was shutting down, he was here, and we talked and all that. And so we decided I was going to join the board, but I joined in August. So I went sort of through the whole pandemic period without actually meeting anybody except a couple of people face to face on the board. And so it was really, really hard to get a sense of and I'm a kinesthetic person. I like sort of seeing and being around people, feeling them. So it was just hard for me to get a sense of the pulse of the board. Now that, of course, now that we're meeting face to face, The flights on the airplanes are one thing where you get to know people, who goes and has drinks after the dinner and hanging out in there. So you just kind of find out stuff by doing things where you see in people doing stuff, and you can kind of begin to understand the culture and understand the vibe and how things are going. And so there's just no substitute. Just to reinforce what Jarvis said, there's no substitute for being around each other and seeing kind of what's happening. There's just no substitute for it.
You also bring up a really good point, and that is the offline time that you get to spend around an in-person board meeting, whether it's the dinners, whether it's lunches, meeting with the executives. When you get to know people in a different setting and you're more familiar with people, you are much more apt to have a difficult conversation because you know that there's trust, there's understanding of intent. Nobody is defensive. You've chatted about where you golfed, where you went on vacation, what your grandkids are like, all that. And once you've established that kind of relationship, board culture is much more easier to mold, where you have a balance between collegiality and challenge, and nobody takes anything personally, but you're there because you're doing it for the right reasons. Building that trust in that offline time is actually really important for those conversations. And I don't care if you sign on to Zoom early. Everyone wants to sign on early so we can trash talk sports. That doesn't do it. It doesn't replace it, right? So there's something, and I would just I think you're right. I think committee meetings in between, catch-ups, things like that, it makes no sense to fly across the country for a 1-hour meeting like that. But for board meetings, I would agree. I would agree. I'm going to ask you for just quick 2 or 3 key takeaways that you would like people to leave with, or one, if there's a really.
I'll let Gaurdie go because he has to leave. So.
Well, I'm not going to leave till 6 o'clock, but
Okay.
sorry, I have a plane to catch. I want to go back to the beginning. So long time ago, I read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this is kind of beginning with the end in mind. If we believe that we are in this perma-crisis world where we are going to have business challenges coming in literally almost every day of some sort, pandemic, war, anti-Semitism, you name it. If we're going to be having all of those different things, then board culture is really, really important, because the company is having to deal with all of this stuff all the time. And the board has to be agile, and the board has to be nimble, and the board has to be effective in dealing with all of those things. So if we can't get in the trench and fuss about what might be hate speech when it comes to the Palestinians, or we can't have a conversation about whether George Floyd died a certain way, or if we can't have a conversation about what the SEC rules on cyber are, if we can't have those kind of difficult conversations in a constructive way with respect and knowledge of each other, then we have a problem being the board of the business. And so, to me, the end in mind is culture is really, really important, because the business is just so stinking difficult. And let's remember, all of us, we don't live it every day like the management team. We're supposed to be above it. We're supposed to be strategic. So when we are applying our time, it better be time well spent. And so we just don't have time to waste. We don't have time to be lazy about it. We have to be good about it. And so if we're going to be good about it, then let's talk about our culture. Let's talk about how we are. Let's invest a little bit of time so that when it gets down to really crunch time, we're going to be good.
Yeah, I'll just agree first. I'll just say ditto 100%. It's just critical that I think boards recognize the importance of culture to our ability to solve difficult problems constructively and have conversations. A couple of things I'll say from the practical matter. I really think these early discussions and the onboarding and offboarding of directors is critical. I don't think we do it well. Generally speaking, as a board, community, and I think we need to spend more time talking about offboarding during the onboarding process, laying out what the standards are, but that means you've also thought about that as a board, and you've got policies and procedures in place so that everybody knows and understands what the expectation is. What else would I say? I think that's
it.
Gaurdie hit the big one.
He took a lot of the big ones.
Yeah.
I would just close by saying I think that we owe it to the executives that we support, the investors that invest in our company, the employees that can't be in the room. We owe it to all the people we represent to make sure, number one, there's the right people sitting around that table. And secondly, the people around the table are productive and working together. I've often said there are certain people who, if I was in a foxhole, I would want them with me. And with the pace of change, with everything going on in the world, we are in foxholes when we're on boards. We need to be prepared for anything that might come our way, because those days of being comfy and just having a good time and getting together once a quarter, those are over. We need to be there to support the executive team in a very, very difficult environment. And I would leave you with the thought that leadership has a huge role, and everyone who is on a board is a leader. So don't take the cop out and say, oh, we got a bad board chair, we got a nom-and-gut person that's not very good. Everyone has responsibility for what the culture is like, and if it's not working out, leave the board. I want to thank both Gaurdie and Jarvis for the amount of time you guys took last year as commissioners. I'm sure that BRC requires a lot of time, a lot of energy, so we really appreciate everything that you put into it for us, and thank you very much today for your time.